The clock read 2:17 in the morning. The house was engulfed in complete silence except for the soft whisper of the wind blowing through the cracks in the window. Kelly, exhausted after a long day at work, was fast asleep. However, the shrill sound of the phone by her bedside broke the silence, yanking her abruptly from her slumber. Dazed and groggy, she reached for the phone. Who could be calling at this hour? Without looking at the number, she answered, her voice still raspy from sleep. "Hello?" she said, expecting either an emergency or a familiar voice. On the other end, there was a brief silence. Then, the response came. A deep, male voice, laced with an emotion Kelly couldn't immediately identify, whispered, "I'm watching you." Her heart raced. Still in a confused state, she tried to make sense of what was happening. "Who is this? Is this some prank?" she asked, a mix of annoyance and fear in her voice. But the call was abruptly ended. She stood frozen, holding the phone while the adrenaline coursed through her body. Could it be just a prank? Or was it something worse? Trying to calm down, she placed the phone back on the receiver. The room was dark and the shadows cast by the furniture seemed to have come alive. Kelly sighed deeply and tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just a wrong number, someone trying to scare her for fun. But still, something about the voice unsettled her. She got out of bed, turned on the bedside lamp, and looked around the room. Everything seemed normal. With hesitant steps, she walked to the window and pulled back the curtain a little to look outside. The street was empty. No cars passed by, no signs of movement. Just streetlights illuminating the cold pavement. After a few minutes of complete silence, she decided it wasn't worth worrying about. "It doesn't mean anything," she muttered to herself, trying to convince herself. She climbed back into bed, turned off the lamp, and covered herself up. But even with her eyes closed, she couldn't shake those 3 words from her mind. In the corner of the room, the phone remained silent. But the feeling of being watched had already taken hold. The sun rose, but the unease from the previous night still lingered in Kelly's mind. The ring of the phone echoed in her thoughts, and the tone of that voice remained vivid, as if it were recorded in her memory. She decided to brush it off. It was just a prank, she thought as she ate her breakfast. The sound of the coffee maker bubbling and the smell of freshly brewed coffee gave her some comfort, but the feeling of being watched remained, like an invisible shadow around her. Back into her routine, she tried to keep herself busy. She worked from home that morning, sitting in front of her computer, answering emails and attending meetings. Everything seemed normal. Until around noon, she noticed something strange. The bathroom door, which she always kept closed, was slightly ajar. Kelly furrowed her brow. She was sure she had shut it after brushing her teeth. Could the wind have opened it, she wondered. Despite the doubt, she didn't think much of it and went to close the door. Later, while preparing lunch, another unusual thing happened. A spoon she had just used disappeared from the sink. She searched the cabinets, the table, even the floor, but the spoon was nowhere to be found. "I must be getting distracted," she muttered, trying to laugh it off. But the unease grew. The afternoon wore on. Small events seemed to accumulate. A chair that had been in its usual spot was now slightly moved. One of her throw pillows had fallen on the floor, even though no one had been in the living room. Kelly started to wonder if she was being paranoid or if something was really going on. As night fell, she tried to unwind by watching TV. The familiar sound of comedy shows filled the living room, and for a moment, she felt a bit more at ease. But suddenly she heard something. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sounded like footsteps coming from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Kelly paused the TV and sat still, trying to listen more closely. Her heart was racing. Could it just be her mind playing tricks? Summoning some courage, she decided to investigate. She turned on the hallway light and walked to the end of the hall. There was nothing there, just the silence of the house, now feeling heavier. Kelly turned around, but when she turned off the light, she had a distinct feeling that something was wrong. Something she couldn't put her finger on, but it made her feel like she wasn't alone. She tried to carry on with her night as usual, but the tension had already set in. Every sound, Every object out of place seemed to scream for her attention. When she finally decided to go to bed, she felt a mix of relief and apprehension as she turned off the lights. She lay down, but her eyes remained wide open in the dark, staring at the ceiling as if waiting for something to happen. The night felt longer than usual. Kelly had finally fallen asleep, but her sleep was restless, interrupted by disjointed dreams and a persistent feeling that something was wrong. At 3:23 a.m., she woke up again, this time with her heart pounding for no apparent reason. The house was completely silent, but something felt out of place. It was then that she heard it. It wasn't a clear sound, but a muffled noise, almost as if someone was dragging something across the floor. Kelly held her breath and remained still, trying to identify the source of the noise. The sound was coming from the living room. For a moment, she considered the possibility that she was imagining things, but the noise continued, a mix of light footsteps and objects moving. With trembling hands, she grabbed the phone next to her bed. She thought about calling someone, maybe the police, but hesitated. What would she say? That she was hearing noises in her house? What if it was just the old plumbing or something trivial? The fear of sounding exaggerated or paranoid made her hesitate. Instead, she decided to investigate on her own. With careful steps, Kelly left the bedroom holding a small flashlight. She tried not to turn on the lights so as not to alert whoever or whatever might be there. She walked slowly down the hallway, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. When she reached the living room, everything appeared to be in place. The couch was where she had left it, the coffee table intact, the curtains still. But when she focused, the flashlight on the floor, she saw something that made her freeze. Her keys were there, lying on the rug. She was sure she had left them on the kitchen counter before going to bed. Kelly bent down, picked up the keys, and looked around as if expecting to find someone hiding. The silence now felt almost deafening, but deep down, she knew she was being watched. Suddenly, the phone rang. The sound echoed through the house, cutting through the silence like a knife. Kelly ran to the kitchen where the landline was. She grabbed it quickly, her heart in her throat. "Hello?" she said, her voice trembling. No one answered. Only heavy, slow breathing filled the line. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" she yelled, but the call ended before she could hear any response. Shaking, Kelly hung up the phone and looked around, feeling panic rise within her. She returned to her room, locked the door, and propped a chair against it. Lying in bed, the phone beside her, she barely blinked. The heavy breathing still echoed in her mind, like a ghost that wouldn't disappear. It was impossible to ignore. Someone was there, and worse, this person knew exactly how to manipulate her fear. The dawn seemed distant. The hours dragged on as Kelly lay motionless in her bed, her eyes fixed on the bedroom door. Every sound, no matter how slight, made her heart race. The phone was still beside her, but she didn't have the courage to use it again. The breath she had heard on the call still echoed in her mind. It was as if that invisible presence was there, inside the walls of her home. When the clock struck 5:12, she finally summoned the courage to get up. She needed answers. Grabbing a knife from the kitchen for safety, she began to search every room of the house. The light of day hadn't come yet, and the shadows dancing on the walls created an even more oppressive atmosphere. In the living room, everything seemed normal, except for a feeling that someone had been there. The rug seemed slightly out of place, and the curtain was slightly open. Kelly knew she always closed it completely at night. Small details that under different circumstances might have gone unnoticed now seemed like glaring clues. She headed to the kitchen. That's when something caught her attention. The landline was off the hook. Kelly was sure she had placed it back after the last call. The discomfort gave way to panic. With trembling hands, she placed the phone back on the receiver and tried to steady her breathing. That's when something completely unexpected happened. The phone rang again. The sound made her jump, causing her to drop the knife on the floor. The phone seemed to vibrate with every ring, filling the room with unbearable tension. Reluctantly, she answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice firmer than she expected. On the other end, a familiar voice responded. I'm closer than you think." Kelly felt a chill run down her spine. The voice was clearer now, closer, as if the person was inside the house. Desperate, she hung up the phone and began searching the house again. Then she remembered the attic. It was a part of the house she rarely used, full of old boxes. The access was through a retractable ladder in the hallway. Kelly stood there, staring at the attic entrance, her body frozen. If someone was in the house, that was the only place she hadn't checked. Gathering her courage, she pulled down the ladder and slowly climbed up. Each step creaked under her weight, increasing her sense of vulnerability. When she reached the top, she turned on the flashlight and illuminated the dark, dusty space. At first, she saw nothing but boxes and old furniture covered in sheets. But after taking a few more steps, something stopped her. In the corner of the attic, there was a dirty mattress, an almost empty bottle of water, and food wrappers scattered around. The smell of mold mixed with the stench of something decayed was unbearable. It was clear someone had been living there. Terror gripped her. Suddenly, a noise came from behind. Kelly quickly swung the flashlight around but saw nothing. Or at least she couldn't see anything. The air felt heavier, and an overwhelming sense of being watched settled over her again. With the flashlight trembling in her hand, she hurried to descend the ladder as quickly as she could, determined to get out of the house. Kelly's heart was pounding as she descended the attic ladder. Each step felt longer than the last, as if time was dragging. When she reached the floor, she slammed the ladder back into place, pushing it up into the ceiling as if that would contain the horror she knew was hidden up there. The thought of someone living there watching her every day was suffocating. Without thinking twice, she ran to her bedroom, grabbed her cell phone, and tried to call the police. But the call wouldn't go through. A sound of static filled the line, followed by an unsettling silence. "This can't be happening," she exclaimed, looking around as if expecting to find an explanation. That's when she heard it again. Footsteps. Not muffled or distant, but clear, precise. They were coming from the hallway, getting closer to where she was. Kelly gripped the cell phone tightly, sweat running down her forehead. With each step she heard, the terror intensified. With no other options, she decided to lock herself in the bathroom. She quickly entered and turned the key in the lock. Inside, she pressed herself against the door, trying to calm her breath. The bathroom was small and cramped, but it seemed like the only safe place at that moment. Then, something made her look into the mirror. A message began to form in uneven, smudged letters, as if someone was writing on the other side of the glass. The words slowly appearing made her feel as though the ground was collapsing beneath her feet. "I told you I'm watching you." Kelly let out a muffled scream and stumbled back, hitting the wall. It was at that moment that the sound of the landline ringing again echoed through the house. The sound seemed endless, an insistent call that Kelly couldn't ignore. She knew answering was a risk, but curiosity, or maybe desperation, won out. Hesitantly, she left the bathroom and walked toward the phone in the kitchen. It kept ringing, each sound louder and more deafening than the last. When she finally picked it up, her hand shook so much she almost dropped it. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely audible. On the other end, the voice responded once again. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was clear, direct, and accompanied by a soft laugh that sent chills down Kelly's spine. "You already know where I am." Kelly dropped the phone and stepped back, her gaze fixed on the hallway leading to the attic. She realized that the person wasn't just hiding there. They were playing with her, manipulating her movements, her reactions. It was like a twisted game, and she was the pawn. Without thinking, she ran for the front door, determined to get out of that house by any means. But when she turned the handle, she realized the door wouldn't open. It was locked. Not from the inside, but as if someone had locked it from the outside. She pounded on the wood, screamed for help, but no one responded. The laughter still echoed in her ears, and that voice, that deep, sinister voice, it wasn't a prank, it was real, it was happening. It was another late-night shift. The city was quiet, almost deserted as it usually is at this hour. I enjoy driving at night. The streets are calmer, and the passengers are generally distracted, speaking little. That sense of silence has always given me a certain peace, but tonight, something felt different. It all started when I got a ride request notification. I glanced at my phone and saw that the pickup point was on a quiet street, almost at the edge of town. Last ride of the night, I thought as I accepted the request. It was my final task before heading home to rest. The GPS guided me along a peaceful route. The streetlights faintly illuminated the path and a light drizzle fell, making the roads even emptier. As I reached the location, I slowed down and looked around. The street was narrow, with a few houses and tall trees casting shadows on the sidewalks. I stopped in front of the marked spot, and for a moment I thought no one was there. That's when I saw him. He was standing under a dim streetlight, as if he'd been waiting for me. He was an ordinary-looking man, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. There was nothing special about him, but there was something about his posture. I can't explain it. He seemed unnervingly still, like a statue, until he took a step forward and entered the car without saying a word. "Good evening," I said, trying to be polite. He responded with a barely noticeable nod and told me the address. It was on the other side of town, a place I didn't immediately recognize. I entered the destination in the GPS and started driving. At first, everything seemed normal. He sat in silence, staring out the window while I focused on the road. But as time passed, the silence started to make me uneasy. Not that I expected a conversation, but there was something strange about this passenger. It was as if the air in the car had become heavier. After a few minutes, he finally broke the silence. "Do you like working at night?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate. I hesitated before responding. "Yeah, I prefer it. It's quieter, less traffic." He mumbled something I couldn't quite understand and went back to staring out the window. I tried to focus on driving, but the atmosphere in the car was growing more uncomfortable. He wasn't looking at me, but I could feel his gaze, as if he was studying me. A few minutes later, he spoke again, this time with a question that caught me off guard. "Have you ever thought about what it would be like to die?" My body froze for a moment and my grip on the wheel tightened. It was such an absurd, out-of-context question, but I tried to stay calm. "No, I don't think I've ever thought about it," I replied, trying to sound casual. "How about you?" I asked almost involuntarily. He smiled, a barely perceptible smile that I caught in the rearview mirror. "All the time," he said, with a chilling calmness. That's when I realized this ride was anything but ordinary. The road seemed endless, and I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over me. The passenger's voice kept echoing in my mind. "Have you ever thought about what it would be like to die?" I tried to push the thought away. Maybe it was just an awkward question, something he said to break the silence. But as the minutes passed, the sense of unease inside the car only intensified. I glanced in the rearview mirror now and then, but the passenger remained still, staring out the window, lost in his thoughts. The rain picked up, hitting the windshield harder, and the headlights cast dancing shadows on the walls of the houses alongside the road. The silence was almost suffocating, but I didn't want to start a conversation. I was already uncomfortable enough, and he seemed like the type who preferred quiet. But then he spoke again, abruptly breaking the stillness. "Have you ever been afraid of the people who get into your car?" The question caught me off guard. I wasn't sure how to respond. Sure, I knew that driving at night could be dangerous, that there was always that risk, but I had never really thought about it so directly. "No, never really thought much about it," I replied, trying to sound calm. But I was starting to question things. How did he know that my job, driving for hours on end, already made me feel vulnerable? He continued speaking, but with each new sentence, the questions became more unsettling. "What if the person you picked up was already dead before getting into your car?" He said it with such lightness in his voice as if it were a casual conversation. My eyes almost drifted from the road when I heard that. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, trying to control the rising panic inside me. I was starting to wonder, if this man was joking or if something far more sinister was happening here. He let out a small laugh, almost inaudible, and leaned back in his seat. I'm just saying, have you ever thought about what it would be like if fate were a thin line? What if you suddenly started doubting where you are and where you're going? I gripped the wheel so tightly that my fingers were going numb. This conversation didn't make sense. Who was this man? Why was he asking me these questions? It felt like he knew something about me that I didn't, like he was trying to throw me off balance, make me question everything. I needed to concentrate. The trip wasn't over yet. He couldn't affect me like this. The road seemed darker now. The lights from the houses and the headlights from passing cars were no longer as sharp. It was just the two of us, in the middle of the rain, in a place that didn't make sense. I looked in the rearview mirror again, hoping to see something, but instead I saw only the passenger's eyes reflected back at me, fixed on me. His eyes were even more intense now, as if he knew exactly what I was feeling. "Are you afraid of death, driver?" he asked again, breaking the silence that had stretched out. I swallowed hard. I didn't know how to answer that. Maybe fear wasn't the problem. Maybe it was the fact that he had put me in a state of total confusion where even reality seemed to be distorting. I couldn't ignore the rising tension anymore. It wasn't just the rain hitting the car or the nonsensical questions. There was something more. The car felt tighter, more suffocating. Time seemed to be passing strangely, as if the distance between the present and the future was becoming blurred. Finally, I spoke, trying to change the subject to relieve some of the pressure. "Do you remember any strange dreams? Something that left you unsettled?" But he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked to the side and slowly shook his head, as if he was reflecting. When he turned back to look at me, his eyes seemed even deeper and his expression had changed. He was serious now, very serious. "I'm the person you'll meet when it's too late," he said, almost whispering. And before I could ask what he meant, he turned back to the window. What did he mean by that? Who was this man? I couldn't stop thinking about those words. The trip was taking longer than usual. We were far from any familiar place. I began to wonder if this ride was really headed to the right destination. I quickly glanced at the GPS and then realized something horrifying. The address he gave me didn't match what I was seeing on the screen. The ride had turned into a nightmare, and I didn't know how to get out of it. I stared at the GPS screen, trying to process what I was seeing. The address the passenger gave me didn't make sense. The map was leading me through empty terrain, a street that didn't exist. There were no houses, no shops, nothing. The screen displayed a blank area, and the route line just kept extending aimlessly. I tried not to panic. Maybe it was just a glitch in the system. This happens, right? The GPS might have failed, or maybe the address had been entered wrong. I thought about asking the passenger, but I didn't know how. The pressure in my chest was so strong that I could barely breathe. I glanced at the rearview mirror, but he was still motionless, just staring out the window with that empty look. The rain was still coming down hard, but now it seemed louder, the sound of the droplets hitting the glass echoing. I tried to keep driving, but the feeling that something was horribly wrong only grew. I took one last look at the GPS, thinking I might find a solution, but there was nothing. There was no destination point anymore. I was just heading into nothing. "This address doesn't exist," I muttered to myself, more to make sense of it than to question the passenger. That's when I realized I didn't know where I was anymore. I wasn't sure if I was still in an urban area or if I had driven into some desolate place. All I knew was that this place felt wrong. I had no more references, and everything seemed to be flowing in a strange, disconnected way. Time seemed to have slowed down. Suddenly, the car started slowing down on its own. It wasn't a mechanical failure, but a phenomenon so subtle that I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks on me. I passed a curve, and when I turned, I noticed the road looked even darker. What once seemed like a street with streetlights now looked like an endless empty path. What was happening? I glanced to the side, but the passenger didn't seem concerned. He was just staring. I looked back ahead, trying to keep control of the car, but it felt like the road was disappearing into oblivion. It was 11:45 p.m. when I left the mall. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a few scattered cars here and there, forgotten relics of others who had likely left hours earlier. The dim lights cast unsettling shadows that seemed to dance on the concrete walls. I've always hated parking lots at night, and to make matters worse, the silence was overwhelming. No music, no voices, just the sound of my footsteps echoing on the cold ground. As I walked toward my car, I tried to shake off that growing sense of discomfort that seemed to increase with each step. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this way, but that night, something felt different, heavier. My mind was filled with random thoughts, bills, appointments, what I'd have for dinner when I got home. But suddenly, they all vanished when I heard the first sound, footsteps. They were light, but loud enough to break the silence. For a moment, I froze in place, trying to pinpoint where they were coming from. I looked over my shoulder, but the parking lot seemed as empty as before. I chuckled quietly to myself, trying to convince myself it was just paranoia. Maybe it was just the sound of my own footsteps reverberating strangely in the empty space. Still, I quickened my pace, wishing I could reach the car as quickly as possible. My keys were in my hand, my fingers gripping the keychain tightly, as if that would somehow protect me from something. Once again, I heard the footsteps. This time, they were clearer, and the echo seemed to be behind me. I glanced around again, scanning the area with my eyes, but there was nothing. No one. Just parked cars, long shadows, and that unnerving silence. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was already racing. Don't be ridiculous, I thought. It's just your imagination. But something inside me wasn't calming down. I felt like I was being watched, like invisible eyes were glued to me. Finally, I spotted my car, parked in one of the last spaces, near the exit. Seeing it brought a sense of relief, but that didn't last long. As I got closer, the sound of the footsteps seemed to draw nearer too. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt heavy, as though something was holding them back. I reached the car and unlocked the doors quickly, jumping in and locking everything with a nervous motion. Sitting in the driver's seat, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I looked through the rearview mirror, the side window, but there was no one, just the emptiness of the parking lot staring back at me. That's when I noticed my hands were shaking. "You're overreacting," I whispered to myself. But something deep in my mind told me this wasn't just paranoia. The feeling of being watched was still there, stronger than ever. Still sitting in the car, I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. But that feeling, it was impossible to ignore. I took a deep breath, adjusted the rearview mirror, and started the car. The sound of the engine filled the silence, but it didn't bring comfort. Before I could pull out of the space, I decided to look around again. Something inside me insisted that there was more to the scene than my eyes could see. That's when I realized the doors hadn't locked automatically as usual. That made me even more alert. With nervous hesitation, I manually pressed the button to lock all the doors. A simple action, but it made me feel a little more in control. However, before I could even put the car in gear to leave, I heard a sound that made my heart freeze. 3 soft, rhythmic knocks on the passenger window. I turned quickly, nearly choking. On the other side of the glass stood a man. He was tall, wearing a dark coat that seemed to swallow his silhouette. The hood obscured part of his face, but I could make out a faint smile on his lips, which only made everything more unsettling. "Hey, sorry, I need some help," he said, his voice muffled by the glass. I was frozen, my body stiff. How had he gotten there without me noticing? I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't seen any movement as I approached the car. He had just appeared. "Please, I just need to ask you something," he insisted, leaning closer to the window. For a moment, I was torn. He didn't seem threatening, at least not at first, but something in his tone deeply unsettled me. It was hard to explain. It was as if each word carried hidden tension, something that didn't match the seemingly innocent request. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the button to crack open the window. My instinct screamed at me to ignore him and leave, but another part of me, maybe out of politeness or fear of seeming rude, considered at least hearing him out. Finally, I opened the window just enough to hear him, but not enough for him to reach inside the car. "Hi, can I help?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my heart was pounding like a drum. The man smiled, a smile that should have seemed friendly, but somehow it seemed anything but. "My battery died. My car is right there," he said, pointing to a vague direction in the parking lot. I looked but couldn't see any cars nearby, just the emptiness. "Do you have jumper cables? Or can you give me a ride to the nearest gas station?" he continued, not moving from his spot. I felt a knot in my stomach. Nothing he said seemed wrong, but something about the whole situation made me uneasy. The way he was so calm, so confident, like he knew exactly how to manipulate me into doing what he wanted. "Sorry, I don't have jumper cables," I quickly responded, trying to end the conversation there. "Ah, that's too bad," he said, leaning even closer to the window. "But can't you at least give me a ride? It's not far." The pressure in his words increased, and so did my discomfort. It was as if he knew exactly how to keep me there, vulnerable. I was at a crossroads. Should I open the door and help or just drive away? For a few seconds I stayed silent, trying to decide what to do. The man was still there, his face close to the glass, his smile unwavering. Something inside me screamed that this wasn't normal. But at the same time, I didn't want to seem cruel or indifferent. What if he really needs help, I thought, trying to convince myself. Finally, I responded, trying to sound firm. "I'm sorry, but I can't help. I'm in a hurry." His smile faltered slightly, but his eyes didn't. They were still fixed on me, as if studying my every move. He tilted his head slightly and said, "Are you sure? It won't take long, I promise." I felt pressured, as if he was challenging my decision. There was something in his tone that felt almost calculated. My unease grew with every word he spoke. It was as if he was trying to manipulate me, using guilt or fear as tools. "I can't," I repeated, more firmly, this time. I could feel my voice shaking, but I hoped he wouldn't notice. For a moment, he just stood there motionless, watching me. Then he stepped back, raised his hands as if surrendering, and said, "All right, I get it. Sorry to bother you." That gesture should have made me feel relieved, but instead, it made me feel even more unsettled. He started walking away slowly, but his gaze stayed fixed on my car. I couldn't take my eyes off him as he walked farther away. My heart was still racing, and something inside me told me this wasn't over. I decided it was time to leave. I started the car and gripped the steering wheel, trying to focus on getting out of there as quickly as possible. But it was then that I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a quick movement. He wasn't leaving. On the contrary, he was coming back. Before I could react, he was back at my car, now pounding on the window. "Hey, open the door, I just want to talk," he shouted, and the friendly tone he had used earlier was completely gone. I panicked. My hands were shaking as I pressed the button to lock all the doors. He kept pounding, harder now, as if trying to break the glass. "Go away," I shouted, not even looking directly at him. My voice cracked with fear. For a moment, there was silence. He stopped banging and just stared at me. Then he smiled again, but this time it was different. There was nothing friendly about it. It was almost triumphant, as if he knew something I didn't. He took a step back, raised his hands once more as if giving up, and calmly said, "All right, you win. Good luck getting home." Those words echoed in my mind as he slowly walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the parking lot. My instincts screamed at me to leave immediately, and that's exactly what I did. I shifted into gear and sped away from that place, trying to push his face out of my mind. But as I drove through the empty streets, I couldn't shake that feeling, that smile, those words. Good luck getting home. I drove in absolute silence, the sound of the engine being the only thing filling the tense air inside the car. My body was stiff, my eyes darting from mirror to mirror, checking if he was still behind me. Deep down, I knew I had made a mistake, leaving so quickly. Maybe he had left, maybe not, but that feeling, something was still wrong. As I took a turn, I noticed a faint light in the rear-view mirror. It wasn't a car behind me, but the glow of a distant headlight. I glanced quickly to the sides, but the streets were empty. I couldn't help but wonder if he had really left or if he was just following me, keeping his distance. The idea of being watched returned full force and my stomach twisted. When I finally got close to home, I started to feel a bit more relieved. The garage light was on, and everything seemed in place. But that sense of unease didn't fade. It was as if with each second, I felt like something or someone was about to appear from where I least expected. I parked in the garage and turned off the engine. I breathed deeply, trying to convince myself it was all paranoia. But before I could leave the car, a cold sensation ran down my spine. I didn't know how to explain it, but I knew he was nearby. I could feel him. That's when I saw the movement. He was standing across the street in the darkness, watching my house. The man. I recognized him immediately, even though I couldn't see all the details of his face in the darkness. But there was something in the way he stood, as if he was waiting. My body froze. How had he gotten there? How did he know where I lived? I hadn't seen him leave the parking lot, and I hadn't seen him on the drive home. He had followed me, that much was clear. Panic began to rise within me. My instinct was to run inside and lock everything, but a part of me still couldn't believe this was happening. I looked at him again, hoping it was just an illusion. But he didn't move. He just stood there, eyes locked on me. I quickly pulled the key from the ignition and opened the car door. As I stepped out of the car, I ran toward the house, desperately hoping to make it inside before he noticed. I heard footsteps behind me. That was the last thing I remember clearly. Then everything went black.